The meteorological anomaly began without warning. At first, it seemed like any other storm that might form over the Atlantic, a swirling mass of clouds that would soon be swept away by the natural forces that had shaped the earth for eons. But this storm, unlike any before it, began to grow at an impossible rate. By the time the first reports came in, it had already dwarfed the largest hurricane on record. It was vast, stretching across the ocean like a monster coiling in the depths, its reach impossible to measure. Meteorologists were baffled. The storm was not behaving as they'd ever seen before. It was moving faster than any of their projections, changing direction unpredictably, as if it were being guided by an unseen force. And then came the strange sound. At first, it was dismissed as a freak phenomenon, an oddity created by the intense pressure systems within the storm. But as the weeks passed, more and more reports emerged, each one consistent. Strange guttural roars, like the growl of an ancient beast, coming from deep within the storm. In the middle of the chaos, footage began to surface. Grainy, distorted, but undeniable. A shadow, enormous, dark, shifting in the heart of the storm, moving with purpose. The storm was not a natural event. It was something else. Something far older. The storm made landfall in eastern South America with the power of 1,000 thunderstorms. It tore through coastal cities in a matter of hours, leveling buildings, flattening entire neighborhoods, and drowning everything in its path. Winds howled louder than the cries of the dying, and lightning struck with such ferocity it seemed the very sky itself was splitting open. The seas churned and rose higher than any wave should, crashing upon the land like the fists of a vengeful god. There was no time to flee, no time to prepare. People scrambled in panic, looking for shelter that was not there. Entire cities vanished beneath the crashing waves, buried in the storm's unrelenting fury. Communications were severed, satellites went dark, and every method of warning became useless as the storm overwhelmed the world. But the storm was only the beginning. As the devastation spread, a new truth began to emerge. In the wake of the storm's passing, scientists were left with no answers, only questions. How could something like this exist? And why did it change course so quickly, so deliberately? Theories were thrown out, but they only deepened the mystery. Some spoke of a force older than the earth itself, others of a primal god awoken from the depths. And then came the reports, the ones that no one could ignore. Videos began to spread, shaky and blurry, but unmistakable. Something was moving within the storm. Not just wind, not just water, something massive. Something that had been hidden in the depths of the ocean, slumbering for centuries, waiting for this moment. A creature whose size defied comprehension. A serpent, coiled in the storm, its shadow flickering beneath the roiling waters. A shape that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, reflected the madness of the storm, and its roar echoed through the heavens themselves. It was Leviathan, the ancient creature of the deep, awakened. The world was only beginning to understand the horror that was unfolding. As the storm moved further inland, cities on the U.S. East Coast began to feel its wrath. But it wasn't just the storm anymore. People began to speak of the ocean itself, rising, surging with an unnatural force, crashing against everything in its path. Entire regions disappeared beneath the waves, cities were swallowed whole, and the ground beneath them trembled like an animal in pain. It was as though the earth itself was being torn apart, as if some ancient force was ripping through time and space itself, remaking the world. The media reported the casualties in a haze of disbelief, unable to keep up with the devastation. Figures appeared, vague but horrifying. Millions of people missing, presumed dead. Governments scrambled to react, but they could not keep up with the sheer scale of the destruction. The storm continued, like a living thing, unstoppable and unrelenting. And then, As quickly as it had started, the storm was gone. Or rather, it had finished its first pass. The world was left broken and silent, drenched in the remnants of the storm's fury. What followed was worse than anyone could have imagined. In the quiet aftermath, a creeping realization spread. This was no ordinary storm. This was an omen. The Leviathan had awoken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The storm's passing left only ruin in its wake. The air was thick with salt water, a sharp, acrid taste in the mouths of those who still clung to life in the devastated cities. Coastal regions, once thriving with life, were now underwater. The survivors, if they could still be called that, gathered what little they had left, knowing there was nowhere to hide. The storm had torn through everything, and it was only the beginning. The vast destruction was just the opening act for something much darker. The first few days after the storm, as the waters slowly began to recede, there were whispers. Whispers of a creature so large it could not possibly be real. A force of nature that was not a product of the storm, but the source of it. Satellite images had captured something immense in the heart of the ocean. An enormous, serpent-like shape beneath the waves. And the media, ever hungry for a story, latched onto the rumors. They began to report the sightings. Fishermen, survivors, and scientists who had witnessed something impossibly huge, moving just beneath the surface of the ocean. It was then that the true nature of the storm was revealed. The winds, the waves, the relentless lightning, they were not random. They were controlled, guided by something far older than man, something that had been sleeping for millennia. The Leviathan had awoken. The beast rose from the deep, towering out of the ocean like a shadow swallowing the sun. Its body was an endless stretch of scales, shimmering black and green, catching the light in unnatural ways. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were like twin voids, empty and cold. They glowed faintly with an eerie, otherworldly light, as though they had seen and understood things no living being ever could. Its mouth was a yawning abyss, lined with jagged, razor-sharp teeth, and it moved with purpose, its enormous form slicing through the ocean with terrifying speed, creating monstrous waves in its wake. No ship could escape it. No land was safe. At first, the world couldn't believe what it was seeing. Governments tried to downplay the reports, clinging to the last remnants of normalcy. Scientists scrambled to understand. How could such a creature exist? Where had it come from? Was it even real? But reality had long since shattered. In mere hours, what was once a strange myth had become undeniable. The Leviathan was no longer a story, no longer a legend. It was real, and it was angry. The storm had been its herald, and now it was here. As the Leviathan breached the surface, it began to move with a terrifying precision. It made its way toward the eastern coast of the United States, a journey that would take only hours, even though the distance was hundreds of miles. The world watched in silent horror as the skies darkened and the oceans churned with unholy rage. There was no escaping it. There were no warnings that could save them. The oceans, once thought to be humanity's greatest resource, had become a vast, open grave. When it reached the coast, the first city to fall was New York. The Leviathan, with its sheer size and strength, simply slid beneath the waves and rose again. Buildings, once towering symbols of human achievement, were torn apart like paper. The streets flooded instantly, a violent, suffocating tide of water that swallowed everything in its path. Skyscrapers toppled, crumbling into the ocean, as the creature's massive tail whipped through the city, flattening entire blocks in seconds. It was a force of nature, a living, breathing disaster. The Leviathan's roar was deafening. It wasn't just the sound of a creature. It was the sound of the earth itself screaming. It echoed across the ocean, a warning to the world that something far older and more powerful than mankind had returned. And it would not stop. Cities along the coast followed, one after another, falling to the wrath of the ancient sea beast. The government tried to respond, deploying every weapon at their disposal, but there was nothing they could do. The Leviathan was unstoppable. It sank warships with a flick of its tail, shattered the defenses of coastal cities with ease, and flooded entire regions within minutes. The creature moved with no care for human life, its purpose clear. It was not here to conquer, but to cleanse. By the time the Leviathan's wrath reached the south, no city had been spared. Survivors, what few there were, spoke of a single, all-encompassing roar that shook the very foundations of the earth. It was as though the creature had torn through the fabric of reality itself. There was no resistance left, no hope. The Leviathan had come to finish what the storm had started. And as it slowly disappeared into the ocean once again, leaving nothing but drowned cities and broken shores in its wake, the world understood that it was over. Humanity's last days had begun, and there was no salvation. The Leviathan was not just a creature from myth. It was a force of nature, an unstoppable beast that had returned to cleanse the earth of everything it had created. The age of man was over, and the world would never be the same again. While the Leviathan's devastation consumed the east coast of the United States, the earth was far from finished with its reckoning. As the last waves from the storm began to recede, and as humanity's last cries echoed in the drowned cities, another ancient terror stirred from the very heart of Africa. The continent, already reeling from the chaos unleashed by the Leviathan, became the next target of the world's greatest and most terrifying threat. From the deepest, most untouched lands of Africa, the Behemoth awoke. At first, it was only a tremor, a shift beneath the earth that set animals fleeing from their once protected territories. The ground cracked open in places where no one had dared to tread, and then came the rumble, a low growling sound that echoed for miles, as though the earth itself was groaning in pain. Scientists, still in shock from the Leviathan's appearance, could scarcely fathom what they were hearing. But those who had heard the old myths, those who had listened to the stories passed down through generations, knew what it was. The Behemoth, the great beast of the land, had risen. The creature was not like anything humanity had ever encountered. It was as large as a mountain, its massive body covered in thick, armor-like hide. Its legs were the size of hills, and each step it took caused the ground to quake. The very air seemed to tremble as the Behemoth moved, and with each thundering footfall, the landscape began to distort. Forests that had stood for millennia were uprooted. Their trees twisted and snapped as the beast walked through them. Rivers that had flowed in their beds for centuries were diverted, turning into raging torrents that surged in all directions. Its eyes, glowing like embers, scanned the land with unrelenting hunger. The Behemoth's roar shook the heavens themselves, a sound so powerful it could be felt in the bones of every living creature. And when it finally stepped into civilization, nothing could stand against it. The first city to feel the Behemoth's wrath was Kinshasa. Once a bustling metropolis, it now stood no chance against the beast. The ground cracked open as the Behemoth's enormous form pressed forward, and as it lumbered toward the city, it brought the earth with it. Buildings, once proud and tall, crumbled beneath its weight. The earth split wide, swallowing entire streets, swallowing whole blocks. The people who had not yet fled were crushed under its colossal steps, their screams lost in the deafening rumble of the beast's approach. Like the Leviathan, the Behemoth moved with an unnatural purpose. It was not mindless, not driven by hunger alone. It was a force of destruction, erasing everything in its path. As it continued its march through Africa, nothing could halt its advance. Cities turned to dust, mountains crumbled into the earth, and forests were torn asunder. What was once a thriving, diverse continent was reduced to a barren wasteland in the wake of its devastation. Governments tried to respond. The military threw everything they had at the creature, from fighter jets to missiles, but the Behemoth simply shrugged off their attacks. Its hide was impervious to their weapons, its strength unmatched. The ground trembled with each strike of its mighty fists, and no city, no matter how fortified, could withstand its fury. The Behemoth's unstoppable advance left entire nations in ruins. As it moved southward, entire rivers were swallowed whole, as though the beast were drinking the very lifeblood of the land. Forests that had stood for centuries were uprooted like weeds, their trees reduced to splinters. The land itself groaned and shifted under its weight. It was as if the very fabric of the earth were being undone. The destruction was total. Entire civilizations that had once thrived, cultures that had shaped a continent, were now gone. There were no survivors. There was no resistance. The Behemoth moved across the continent like a living storm, reshaping the world with every step. In the end, nothing remained. No people, no wildlife, no evidence that the great cities and rich cultures of Africa had ever existed. The ground was scarred, the air thick with smoke and dust. It was as if the earth had been erased, and from its ruins, there was nothing but silence. The Behemoth paused for a moment, standing in the center of the land it had devastated. Its eyes glowed softly, as though it were surveying the destruction it had wrought. Then, with one last rumble, it turned and vanished into the wilderness, its immense form disappearing into the horizon, leaving nothing but a blackened, broken land in its wake. The world now had its answer. The Leviathan had risen from the ocean. The Behemoth had ravaged the land, and there was no place safe from the fury of these ancient forces. Humanity, once proud and confident, had no power left to stop them. The earth was changing, and mankind had no place in this new world. The beasts were not here to conquer. They were here to reset the earth. The Behemoth's rampage had barely subsided when another unimaginable horror descended upon the world. While the land lay scarred and broken, its heart still trembling from the Behemoth's devastation, the skies themselves began to darken. A new terror was looming in the heavens, something far more ancient than humanity could have ever believed. From the farthest reaches of the atmosphere, something vast and terrifying descended, blotting out the sun as it grew closer. It came from the east, a shape larger than any bird, a creature of myth that had remained silent for eons. The world watched in horror as the dark shadow grew larger and larger until it was clear what it was: the Z's. A beast from the ancient texts, the Z's was a creature so enormous that it was said to cover the earth with its wings, casting a shadow that could last for days. With feathers like iron, wings as wide as continents, and eyes that burned with the fire of the heavens, the Z's was a force of destruction from the skies. It had not been seen by mankind for millennia, thought to be a legend, an ancient tale. But now it was real, and it was descending with fury. The first sign of the Z's arrival was the fire. As the creature soared above the land, the heat radiating from its wings caused the air itself to ignite. A blistering, infernal heat that seared the very earth beneath it. Whole forests combusted in an instant, their towering trees reduced to ashes as though they had been set on fire by the hand of a god. Rivers boiled, the water evaporating in the creature's wake. What once was fertile land became a barren, smoldering wasteland, blackened and charred beyond recognition. Then came the roar, a sound that came from the heavens themselves, deafening and terrible. It was not the cry of a mere bird, but a sound that shook the earth and cracked the sky. The Z's call echoed across continents, and wherever it rang, cities turned to flames. Its wings beat with thunderous force, and the very air shimmered with heat. As it soared over China, its wings sent massive gusts of wind that tore apart everything in their path. The first city it reached was Beijing. By the time the first warning reached the people, it was too late. The Z's massive wings swept over the city, and within moments, buildings crumbled, caught in the inferno that followed. The heat was so intense that flesh itself ignited, and within seconds, the entire skyline was nothing but a column of smoke, ash, and fire. The people screamed, their cries drowned out by the roaring wind and the crackling of flames that consumed everything in their path. Within hours, the entire northern region of China was ablaze. Whole cities vanished beneath a wall of fire, their structures and the lives within them reduced to nothing. Disease moved with purpose, its fiery trail turning forests into smoke and turning the land into a lifeless desert of ash. Its wings spread across the sky, blotting out the sun and leaving the world beneath it in a perpetual twilight of flames and smoke. Governments tried to respond, as they had done with the Leviathan and the Behemoth, but there was no force on Earth that could challenge a creature from the heavens. Fighter jets were launched into the air, missiles fired, but they were nothing against disease. With a single flap of its wings, it could send jets crashing to the ground, their pilots incinerated before they had a chance to react. Its scales, tough as iron and reflecting the flames of its own making, were impervious to anything mankind could throw at it. As disease moved further westward, whole regions were consumed in its wake. It passed over India, sweeping across the subcontinent, turning the land to ash. No place was safe. Cities, temples, forests, all were reduced to nothing, their existence erased by the fires that followed in the disease's wake. The air itself was thick with smoke, and the world seemed to suffocate beneath the heat. Humanity, already reeling from the destruction caused by the Leviathan and the Behemoth, had no defense against the firestorm above. The skies were no longer a place of refuge, but a domain of terror. Disease did not rest. It moved across the globe like a vengeful god, setting fire to everything in its path. The vast, once proud cities of the East were reduced to smoldering ruins. Nothing could escape the wrath of the sky. In the end, after days of unrelenting fire and destruction, disease flew off into the horizon, its wings disappearing into the smoke-filled skies. The world below was unrecognizable. China was a graveyard of charred remains. The land, once rich and diverse, had been reduced to a hellscape of ash and flame. There were no survivors. The skies had burned. The earth had been scorched. The oceans had been swallowed by the Leviathan. The land had been shattered by the Behemoth. And now, the very air itself had been turned to fire. And still, the world did not know peace. The earth had become unrecognizable. The Leviathan had drowned the coasts. The Behemoth had shattered the land, its thunderous footsteps leaving continents broken and cities crushed. Disease had set the skies alight, turning forests and civilizations alike to ash. And now, the planet was left in a state of desolation, a charred and broken shell of the world that had once been. Survivors, what few there were, had no place to turn. The forces that had swept through their homes, their nations, their very way of life, had left no room for hope. Those who tried to escape found no refuge, for the beasts had not just destroyed places. They had destroyed existence itself. And even as the fires from the disease's wake began to die down, the land was uninhabitable. The sky was thick with smoke, and the oceans churned with the aftershocks of the Leviathan's wrath. The air was acrid, heavy with the smell of death and ash. Humanity had no place in this new world. The world leaders, scattered and broken, had done what they could. The military fought back with everything they had. Missiles, bombs, nuclear warheads. But against such immense power, it was all pointless. The creatures were beyond human comprehension, their fury unstoppable. Their sheer existence was the end of humanity, the death knell for a species that had once ruled the earth. In the final days of resistance, nations sent their last communications, begging for help that never came. The international lines of defense were broken. There was no world anymore, only chaos. The earth trembled beneath the weight of the Behemoth, who continued its rampage across the vast, empty plains of Africa. The Leviathan had left behind flooded, barren coasts, and disease fires still smoldered in the remains of the east. The surviving human forces were scattered, and their final broadcasts were filled with nothing but despair and the deafening silence that followed. As the Leviathan returned to the ocean, it was no longer a matter of fighting or fleeing. The end had come. The earth had been purged, and nothing remained but ruins. No city stood tall. No nation functioned. The very earth was a broken landscape, devoid of life. Mountains had fallen, rivers had run dry or were flooded, and forests were reduced to blackened stumps. And still, the monsters that had wreaked such havoc moved through the ruins, each continuing its relentless course as though their purpose had not yet been fulfilled. The Leviathan swam through the darkened oceans, its path carving through what had once been the blue heart of the earth. The Behemoth's massive form continued its slow destruction, each footfall sending tremors through the remnants of a world that had no defenses left. Disease had long since disappeared from the sky, but its influence remained, the smoke from its flames lingering in the atmosphere. It was in these final moments that the world understood the true nature of the destruction. These ancient beings were not sent to conquer or destroy, but to reset. The earth had been allowed to grow unchecked for millennia, but the balance had been shattered by mankind. The beasts, Leviathan, Behemoth, and Z's, had come not to obliterate, but to cleanse, to return the earth to a state where it could begin again. The destruction was absolute, leaving no room for humanity, for any trace of their existence. The world would be remade. It had been reset. As the last echoes of the chaos faded, the world was silent. Not a sound, no wind, no storm. Just the remnants of what had been. The skies were heavy with ash, and the earth below lay still, as if holding its breath. The earth had died, and it was not the end. It was the beginning. The earth stood still, broken and barren. The remnants of humanity's existence were nothing but faded echoes, murmurs of a time long past. The Leviathan had sunk the oceans, the Behemoth had ravaged the land, and the Z's had burned the skies. Nothing remained. The creatures, having completed their tasks, seemed to stand still, their work done. The world was in its final throes, the breath of life extinguished from every living thing, leaving behind only the ashes of what once was. The air hung heavy with the stench of decay, thick with the remnants of destruction. The last storm clouds from the Z's fiery descent hung low over the earth like a dark, oppressive blanket. The once blue oceans had turned murky and still, lifeless under the weight of the Leviathan's passing. Vast stretches of land were left cracked and scarred, stripped of vegetation, its soil barren and poisoned by the great beast's march. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. The world was dead. In the final hours of the earth's reckoning, there were no survivors to witness the ultimate truth. There was no humanity left to mourn its end. The creatures had ensured that. The earth had been cleansed of their presence, wiped from existence. The towering cities, the great civilizations, the forests and oceans, all were gone, and with them every trace of human life. But then, something strange began to happen. A rumble, a low, faint tremor beneath the still earth. At first, it was barely perceptible, the faintest of vibrations, as though the planet itself was shifting. It started from the core, slowly spreading outward. The land trembled, cracked, and groaned as if in response to a force far greater than anything that had come before. A strange energy pulsed through the earth's veins. The creatures had not simply destroyed. It was as if they had set something into motion, something much older, much deeper. The rain began to fall. It was a soft drizzle at first. Thin, fragile drops that dripped from the sky, splashing gently on the cracked earth. The air felt thick and heavy with the promise of something new, something far more ancient than any of the beasts that had ravaged the land. It was as if the earth itself were breathing again, drawing in the rain as it began to heal. But the rain was unlike anything seen before. It was clear, pure, and seemed to pulse with a strange, unearthly power. With every drop that fell, the earth began to change. The scorched land began to soften, and the blackened soil, once dead and dry, began to pulse with life. Tiny tendrils of new growth. Small, fragile plants pushed their way up from the cracked earth. Flowers bloomed in the most unlikely places. Grass began to sprout where once there had been only ash. The world that had been scorched, drowned, and burned was now beginning its slow, painful return to life. The creatures that had once ruled this world, the Leviathan, the Behemoth, and the Z's, watched from their respective corners of the earth as if they had completed their purpose. They did not interfere with the earth's rebirth, but they stood still, their immense forms looming over the landscape, silent witnesses to what was unfolding. The rain continued, falling steadily, washing away the last remnants of destruction. What had been a wasteland only moments ago was slowly, inexorably, returning to a new state of existence. The air, once thick with smoke and ash, now carried the scent of fresh earth and growing life. The earth was healing. The creatures, now gone from the surface, left no trace of their presence. They had fulfilled their roles in the planet's transformation. And as the final drop of rain fell, the land was transformed. The earth had not ended. It had reset. The new world, shaped by the ancient forces that had cleansed it, was beginning to rise from the ashes of the old one. A world where humanity had no place. A world where only nature would thrive. The rain was its first sign of life, and with it, a new cycle had begun. The creatures were gone. The beasts had fulfilled their purpose. The earth was theirs now, and the future belonged to a world that had been reborn. And humanity, for all its achievements, had been wiped away. Its brief existence only a memory in the great, eternal story of the earth. The earth, now reshaped by the fury of ancient forces, lay in a strange, surreal stillness. The rain had stopped, and the land, once scarred by the Leviathan's waves, the Behemoth's crushing steps, and the Z's fire, was slowly and quietly beginning to heal. It was as if the planet itself was breathing, stretching, and reaching for something new. Where once there had been oceans full of life and mountains that touched the sky, there were only remnants of their former grandeur. Vast stretches of barren land and flooded plains. But beneath the surface, something was stirring. The land itself was beginning to pulse with a life force that no one had expected. Tiny, fragile shoots of green began to rise from the cracked earth, pushing their way through the broken soil as if they had been waiting for this moment for eons. The creatures, the Leviathan, the Behemoth, and the Z's, had left their marks on the world, but they had not destroyed it. They had reset it. The forces that had once ruled the earth had been too strong, too ancient to be comprehended by humankind. And in their wake, they had left the planet for something else, something new. The first sign of life was small, a fragile sprout breaking through the scorched earth. It was almost imperceptible at first, just a faint green tendril, fragile and weak, but it was life. And from that one small sprout, the land began to fill with growth. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, but then faster as the days passed, the earth began to reclaim what had once been taken from it. Flowers bloomed in the most unlikely places. Vines curled their way up the remains of the destroyed buildings, winding through the skeletons of cities that had once been full of life. What was once a vast, barren desert of ash began to shift, to grow. Grasses spread over the cracked earth, covering it in a blanket of green that had not existed for eons. What had been blackened and destroyed was now alive again. In the once great oceans, the waters that had been stilled by the Leviathan's presence were now beginning to churn. They moved sluggishly at first, the rhythm of the waves returning to their natural cycle. Fish, plants, and creatures began to return to the waters, slowly at first, but with an increasing abundance. The deep blue seas that had once been swallowed by the ancient beast were returning to their original form, alive, teeming with new life. Even the skies were not left untouched. Where once the burning wings of the seas had scorched the heavens, now the clouds began to gather again, but this time they were soft and white. Birds, small and fragile at first, began to flutter across the newly healed air. The sky, once stained with the fiery remnants of the seas, was now beginning to clear, giving way to bright, untainted light. The atmosphere, once thick with smoke and destruction, was now fresh, clean, and full of life. In time, new animals began to appear. Creatures never before seen by human eyes emerged from the depths of the Earth's reborn landscapes. Some were strange, almost alien in their form, but all were uniquely adapted to this new world. They roamed freely in the wide-open plains that had once been cities, now covered in wild grass and new forests. The predators that had once ruled this planet, along with humanity's dominance, were gone, and in their place, a delicate, balanced ecosystem was beginning to form. The Earth, no longer the home of man, had become a sanctuary for all the life that would follow. The creatures that had brought about the reset had done their work. They had torn down the old world, and in its ashes, a new world was rising. A world free from the scars of humanity's destruction, free from the destructive forces that had come before. A world where life could begin again, this time without the interference of mankind. The land was still silent, but it was no longer empty. It was alive in ways that no one had ever dreamed possible. And it was only the beginning. The creatures, the Leviathan, the Behemoth, and the Z's had fulfilled their purpose, but they had left the Earth to itself now. They had returned it to its natural state, free of the chaos humanity had brought upon it. The Earth, at last, had been reborn. And as the sun rose over the horizon, casting light on the new world below, it was clear. Life would continue here, but it would not be the same. The Earth was no longer a place of man's dominion. It was a place of natural harmony, a world where life would flourish once again, but in its own time and in its own way. The reign of humanity had ended. The reign of nature had begun. The Earth, now scarred and reshaped, stood in a profound silence, as though the world itself was taking a deep breath after the devastation that had passed through it. The ground, once cracked and charred, had begun to heal in ways no one could have anticipated. A quiet hum filled the air, as if the planet itself were awakening from a long slumber, stretching, reaching out to embrace the new life that had been seeded into the soil. Where entire cities had once stood, their towering spires now reduced to crumbled husks, the land was beginning to reclaim itself. The streets that had once been paved with concrete and steel were now covered with layers of moss and creeping vines. What had once been buildings, monuments to human achievement, were now blanketed in a shroud of green, their hollowed structures acting as silent monuments to a forgotten time. The land no longer carried the scars of humanity's fleeting dominance. It was healing, rebirthing itself in a way that could not be reversed. The oceans, too, had transformed. Once swallowed by the Leviathan, the seas now moved with a gentle rhythm, as if they, too, were finding their natural flow again. The waters were clear, teeming with life. Fish, plants, and creatures that had never before known the touch of human hands. The once dead oceans now rang with vitality, an endless cycle of growth and decay that marked the balance of life. On the land, the new plants and animals grew. They were strange, otherworldly in appearance, born of a planet that had shed its former skin and was now emerging anew. Some creatures were small and fragile, like delicate insects that fluttered across the green fields. Others were massive, great, lumbering beasts with skin like stone, moving with the slow, purposeful grace of a world that had no need to rush. They were the new rulers of this world, taking their place in the ecosystem that had evolved from the chaos that had once been. The balance of nature had returned, and for the first time in an age, it was not a balance disturbed by the ambition of humankind. The air itself felt different now, clearer, fresher, as if the smoke and ash that had once filled it had been swept away by the very wind that now blew through the trees. The sky was no longer dark with the heavy clouds of destruction. The sun shone brightly, casting its golden rays over a land that had been reborn. It was a new world, untouched by the stain of humanity's presence. What had once been a bustling metropolis was now a jungle, a forest of wild trees, vines, and moss. The great highways and avenues that had once connected the cities were now cracked and overgrown with grass. What was once paved with stone was now covered in dirt and flowers. The world had reset itself, erasing the marks that had been left by humankind and replacing them with the wild, untamed beauty of nature. In the distance, the creatures, the Leviathan, the Behemoth, and the Z's, were nowhere to be seen. They had fulfilled their purpose. They had reshaped the world, torn down the old, and given birth to the new. They were no longer needed. The earth, now free from their ancient power, continued its quiet transformation. The earth was no longer the home of man, and it never would be again. This was a world for the creatures that lived here now, a world where nature would thrive without the interference of humankind. The cycle of life and death had returned to its natural course, and with it came the quiet understanding that everything in this new world had a place. No matter how strange, no matter how different. The earth had reset itself, and in its rebirth, it had cast off the legacy of humanity. The sun set over the horizon, casting long shadows over the new world. The creatures of the land, the sky, and the sea moved through the world with an ancient rhythm, as though they had always been there, as though they had always known this was how it was meant to be. The earth had turned its page, and the story of humankind had ended. But the story of the planet was far from over. As the night fell over the quiet, reborn land, the earth remained, alive, thriving, and forever changed.